Hello, I'm Shannon Staten. I'm the Director of Campus Housing at the University of Louisville, and I've been asked to give a brief history about the campus housing program here at the university. One of the things that I can say is that we've been around for quite some time. However, as I look back through the historical archives, there wasn't a lot of organized housing on campus until the 40s, the 1940s. Before that, while the university was here, because we are a very old institution and traditional institution, the housing was really taken care of by locals who lived in the community and would open their homes and let students come live with them. There was one house I found that in 1937 the university owned for 1 year. It housed 11 young women and it had a house mother, and the only record of it is that 1 year. After that it did not belong to the university, and we're not sure what happened to that house mother and or that group of students. But what we do know is that as the university began to develop and really take ground, there was a need for housing. Students could live in homes if they didn't live locally by renting and boarding houses, but they weren't really being served well because they couldn't get back and forth to campus very easily, and also there just wasn't a mixture of students who could learn from each other in that format, as we know campus housing to be of today. So in the 40s, what we found was that that's when we started really as an institution thinking how we were going to take care of the students who were coming to be with us and to study with us. We, at that time, as many campuses experienced, we built several military huts. They were huts that were used for as the service people came back from from the war and wanted to come back into school. As the influx of military personnel at that time into colleges occurred. These huts, though, were for men only. Women were not allowed in, and even though we know there were women that were involved with the war in the Red Cross and in other ways, they just weren't allowed in to live in those areas. So women continued to live off campus by boarding house stature for many, many years. But starting in the 40s, we had those huts. Now, we did also know that at that time there were other things going on around campus. There were several people who had built stately homes along what is now called Unity Place and are now some of our Greek houses. Those were lived in by these families. They were an extension of what we know of Old Louisville to be, which is one of the oldest Victorian home neighborhoods in the country and just to the north of our campus. So Unity Place extended beyond and gave a chance for some of those homes to be right at our campus. And they were lived, really not even used other than by private families until later on. More in the 60s is when those started turning over to university purpose. And at this time, in those homes, they're historical homes, they're still present. That's where we house some of our Greek organizations. They give a stature to that program that is great, and they're along a line of a row there, so the students are together and the Greek community can be there. So they are something that we have held on to over the years as part of our history and what's happened on campus. Another home that we knew about was the Robbins home. And that was a home that was built right on the site beside what is now the Speed Museum on our campus, which is one of the prestigious museums in the world where we house many paintings and sculptures and lots of things. So Mrs. Robbins was one of the owners of the Speed Museum, and as they broke ground to build it on this campus, she decided she wanted to monitor the construction. So she had this home built. First, the construction company built her place first, and then she lived there throughout the construction period of the museum. Once the museum opened, then she turned that home over to the university with the caveat that it would be used for women housing, so women who wanted to live on campus, until there was a way to take care of those women in a different method or a different building. So that was a women's residence hall for several years, and then finally converted over into some office space before actually it was just recently, within the last couple of years, demolished to make room for an extension of the Speed Museum, actually, which is pretty ironic with that and why it was torn down. So throughout the early 40s, though, is when we started seeing things. We had a dean of women, we had a dean of men, who felt very strongly that we should start having housing on campus. We're looking at some of the older campuses up in the Northeast, the Harvards, the Yales, that were starting to provide some things and wanted to have the same environment on campus. And so that's when some of our earlier buildings started being built, in the early 50s. We had a couple of different residence halls, or dormitories at that time as they were known, because strictly it was just an environment where students could live and be able to study, but there wasn't a lot of educational development going on in the 50s and 60s in those areas. It was all about keeping the rules set and the policies followed and sanctions issued if the students didn't follow them. So they were dormitories at that point. Threcold Hall, Miller Hall were two that were, and Stevenson Hall were three, actually Stevenson being the first, that were built during that time. We continue to use Miller and Threcold even now in 2014 as a residence hall facility. And anyone who's lived in those buildings over the years would be able to come and see something that looked very similar to when they lived there as well. While we've updated them, we've kept them clean and in good shape, they still are in the same format, which is the rooms with a bath down the hall, maybe some lounge space where students could study, and then a lobby. So those are not what you would think of as current day resident facilities. However, they are very strong communities for our students because they learn to live together and share together and work together in an environment where you just don't have a lot of individual space. And so we do continue to have those two buildings online. We have a few other buildings that were built in the 50s and 60s during that time as well, mostly the same style. The double loaded corridors, rooms on both sides of the hallway, a bathroom somewhere in the hallway, either in the middle or down at the end, and then common space down on the first floor. At that time, when those were being built, we would usually use some kind of a hall director or dorm director who managed that building. So there was an apartment in each of them where a staff member could live and could oversee the students that lived in that building and take care of their needs. It was during that time, though, that it still wasn't very organized as far as an intentional academic support purpose. It was strictly to take care of the students who couldn't live at home and couldn't commute so that they could come to the university and live and go. During the 50s, we also found that some of those military huts were opened up for a short time period for female students to be able to live in them. They divided up, and some women lived in a couple of the huts while men lived in the others. But it was really determined only after a couple of years that wasn't a good use of the space. And so they wanted, once we had Stevenson built in the late 50s, that's when women moved over into Stevenson, and we still used the military huts as we knew them for the men until they were torn down later in the 60s and 70s. So during all this time, we're trying to learn how to live on campus and to function. However, the campus is still very much a commuter campus. Most of the residents, or most of the students of the university, could commute from home and did. There wasn't a lot of recruitment done beyond the city. In fact, up until around 2000, the state considered the University of Louisville, once it became associated as a state institution, as an urban campus to take care of the needs of the urban students that might be coming from the Louisville area. In the state of Kentucky, there's not a lot of urban space, and so it was felt that those students needed their own special campus that understood their needs and their backgrounds and their culture. So really only in the 2000s have we begun to branch out as an institution, as we've become a Research One environment, to bring students from all around the world and all around the country into our area, and therefore have had to provide a whole different living environment for those students. So until the late 1990s, the campus grew. There were buildings built. There were a couple of apartment buildings built on both the Health Science campus and the Belknap campus. They were able to be used by families, so it allowed for families to be able to be on campus and to live, and functioned really both of those as family units until we converted the University Tower apartment on the Belknap campus into undergrad single housing and graduate single housing in the mid-90s. So the university was meeting needs. They had the need for men. They had what they could provide for men. They could provide for women, and they could provide for families. And so for many, many years, that was fine, and that met the goals, and that was what the university thought that they could and wanted to do. So at that point, by the mid-1990s, we were able to take care of about 9% of the student body in campus housing. Again, we had the community bath buildings that had the double-loaded corridors, and we had the apartment buildings that had been built in the 70s. But we really did not have any kind of housing that was considered modern or up to date by the terms of the higher education field and by the terms of what our families were starting to desire and want. As we moved into the 90s, even at home, students were no longer sharing bedrooms as much. They had a lot of things to themselves, and so it became not as attractive to them to move onto a college campus and have to have so much shared space. So in 1989, we did break ground on our first suite style housing on campus, which was Louisville Hall. And that brought us 215 beds that were in suites that had bedrooms and a small living area and a bath. So students had a little more private space and a little more individualization in the way they functioned. It was a building that was popular, that filled from the very beginning, and students were very happy to have, and continues to be a popular building today. But at that point we knew that we were needing to grow, we needed some new housing, we needed to be able to add to what we had, which was about 1,900 beds at that point, and we wanted to change the whole concept of the campus into a more residential-based campus environment. And so as we looked at that, we actually became one of the first campuses in the country to invite private partners to come onto campus and help us design and build some new residence facilities. And the president at that time, who wasn't real satisfied with a 9% ratio being able to handle students, challenged us to go to 19%. So with 19% as our goal, we knew that we had to build about 1,200 more beds on campus. And we worked with the private developer and with a foundation, the University of Louisville Foundation, and designed and built 4 new buildings that brought us those beds. And these buildings were considered modern at that point. One was a full apartment complex that just had all the amenities a student could want: the swimming pool, the volleyball court, the exercise rooms, the TV viewing rooms, but also full apartments. So students had private bedrooms with private baths, and they were sharing the living room and the kitchen with 2 to 3 other people. This provided an in-between for us to give students a still chance to share a little bit and learn how to be part of a community, but to have the private environment that families seem to want them to have. What we knew, though, was that students living in that building and in those types of apartments were not connecting with each other as well. They were not getting to know the rest of the community. It was easy for them to go behind their apartment door and not come out. They weren't feeling like they weren't studying together. They weren't doing a lot of activities together. And so as we designed and built the next buildings, we went back to a suite style environment where we would have double and single bedrooms that shared baths, not the living rooms that we had in Louisville Hall, still kind of double loaded corridors, but then had study lounges and kitchens again, so that we could pull students back out and not have them totally be inside their room whenever they were in the building. And we have found, as housing has found across the country, that that's a good mix. That's a good model for students to still get some community development. As we built those, and we built the last one in 1996, so by the mid-1990s, we had met the 19% goal that the university wanted us to meet. We could house about 2,900 students at that time. Remember, we started at 1,900, we went to 2,900, and we had new buildings on campus, so we had things that students wanted to live in, and were choosing to live on campus a lot more than they had been before. But what we didn't have was an environment of campus that really supported residential living. Students who were on campus, if the university had to close suddenly, say for an ice storm or a tornado weather activity or a flood or anything that would close us down suddenly and not have classes, there would not be places for students to eat. There was not anything open other than the residence hall, so students couldn't come and go and get out and socialize. And what we found through the 90s and into the early 2000 years is that that wasn't enough. Parents didn't like it, students didn't like it. And it wasn't safe. Students were getting out and doing their own thing in those ice storms or in those snowstorms, and they weren't really being taken care of in a way that they could be safe and they could have activities that would be beneficial to them. So the university started working very diligently in the early 2000s to once again break ground and do something differently. And we started talking about how do we grow the campus even more. And at that time, our next president, President James Ramsey, challenged us to grow again. And he wanted us to be able to take the campus housing stock to 32% of the full-time class students on campus could live with campus housing. However, we were out of land, and we didn't have a lot of resources, and so we had to be creative. And we decided at that time, by about 2009, to start partnering once again with private partners, but to have them build off campus on their own land, and to build apartments and communities that would be for upper class students. Because the upper class students, as they left the campus or wanted to, after they lived the first year on campus, didn't like the rules. They wanted a little more flexibility. They wanted independent living. They wanted to be able to take care of themselves. And we agreed that they should be able to do that. So by building these off-campus facilities, we were able to bring properties right on the edge of campus. We stretched the campus without having to buy the land or put the money into the projects, and we provided for more students. That's when we looked very seriously at the campus culture itself. And as a university decided it was time to become residential. And that meant increasing all the services on campus that students would need. So we re-evaluated all of the dining service that was provided and partnered with a new partner to come onto campus and really expand the dining program, the dining services. We went from 3 locations where you could buy something to drink or maybe something to eat during the day between 9 and 5 on Monday through Friday to 11 different sites on campus, some of which were open into the late evenings and all of which provided some kind of service over the weekends. So students had places they could eat every day of the week, and they had locations they could grab a late night snack or a late dinner or an early morning breakfast, and that was a much needed expansion of our services. Once we did that and we looked at the library services and other student services and decided to really encourage what we were doing in the residence halls to expand services, we were able to create a residential environment where students are cared for. Now if this university closes, as it did this winter several times, there are recreational facilities open for the students to be able to get out and exercise and join up with groups of friends and be able to participate in things. The Student Activity Center is open with the student involvement staff involved, trying to make sure that there are activities and game rooms and TVs and areas. Dining services will serve every day, whether we're open or closed according to their schedule. So students had places to go, they have things to do. That's part of being a residential life program. And so now we aren't dorms. We haven't been for quite some time. But even as a campus, we're not a commuter dorm campus. We are a residential campus that provides living environments that are productive. We have living learning communities that provide for student learning through the academic expanded experience. We have mentoring from faculty and administrators in the residence halls. We have student leaders that are trained to be peer mentors. We do a lot that is much more than just letting a student live and a place for them to eat, but learning how to be part of a community, learning how to be successful as a student, being able to academically grow. So that's where we've come over the years. So we've come from a house that had 11 women in it on the south end of campus with a house mother and that was the only place that students could live, to barracks where we took care of the military who were coming back to campuses, men mostly, but a few years there we had some women involved. And then into traditional residence halls that were built in the 50s and 60s that provided for us nice environments for students at that time, but didn't grow well with the changing culture of the United States student especially. And so by the 70s and 80s, we started moving into more suite-style housing. We started providing for more electrical service, more data service, the things that students were wanting to and needing. And now, in 2014, we have 5,300 beds that we call campus housing. On campus is still about 2,900, so the rest of those are off campus in those communities I mentioned earlier. We have a live-on requirement for first-year students, so they have to live on campus in both the older and the newer buildings, but in the 2,900, and that is where we give very intentional mentoring and programming and adjustment to help the student be ready to be independent. And then we have those 2,400 beds off campus that are provided for by private owners, but are communities of students. Anywhere from 400 to 800 students living in communities of apartments and in a complex kind of environment where they have to learn how to be good neighbors and good community members. So that's our what we provide at the moment, and we hope to keep growing with that as the university grows. But we know that the University of Louisville, as it has evolved over the years, has become a premier campus and a destination campus for students from across the country and around the world. Now, I've talked a lot about the buildings themselves and about how we've taken care of the students. What I haven't talked about is the leadership of the program. And it had its own interesting start and development. The bottom line is there has only been 5 housing directors in all the history of the university, so from the 40s on. What happened is that as we built those first buildings, remember I said there was a dean of women and a dean of men. Well, the managers of those early residence halls, or of the barracks and of Robbins Hall and some of those smaller facilities as we got started, reported directly to the dean of men or dean of women. And if there was any discipline needed, if there was any help needed with that student, they did it through that office or those offices. And that was very common at that point across the country. That in the United States you usually had a dean of men, a dean of women, and they managed most of the student life piece for the university, as well as some of the academic connection. So we did that for quite some time. But then what we found was that we had a dean of students at that point named Harold Adams, and he had been here for a couple of years. And as he came and was here, he was asked if he would take on managing the residence halls. He was the first that was not of a combined system. So he was the first dean of students. And so when he was hired, he didn't think much about that. He was going to help manage the campus, but he hadn't thought about the housing piece. And when they asked if he would take on the management of the halls, he agreed at that point to do that. However, he agreed with the condition that they would think about how they were going to manage housing in the future. So the university did some research and worked with some things, and they ended up hiring the first director of housing was Chat Sue. And Chat Sue came in 1980. So remember, we've had housing for 40 years already, and we have our first director of housing in 1980. Chat Sue came in with some very clear instructions and a charge that he had to make sure that the residence halls were being run properly, that the students were behaving as they should, that the University of Louisville student could live on campus safely, and with the image that they wanted the campus student to be. And so he focused on the sanctioning, the disciplining, the helping students learn how to live away from home piece, and more of how they handled themselves and how they conducted themselves with the student code of conduct and the student code of how to work within the academic world. So Chat Sue did that, and was a great leader to start that with the housing program, because it needed some organization. It needed the organization of policies and procedures and how things happen. Families were starting to ask more questions about that and expecting more of that, and so he was able to do that. As he left a few years later, Denise Gifford came on board as the director of housing to follow him. And Denise was a very different kind of an administrator. She was very much student development based, had been trained in student development theory and behavior, believed that students could learn through behavioral modification and could learn by being surrounded by an environment that supported growth and community and life and being able to take care of yourself, but at the same time caring for the community around you. So Denise started the program that would be more known as a residential life program on campus, where she really worked on who she had managing those halls. She converted the staff or changed so that the staff managing the residence halls at the time that she was here became professional full-time staff. They had to be staff who had been trained in higher education or student development specialties. They were coming out of master's programs. So for the first time, we had master level staff managing residence halls, living on campus, working with those. And she did a tremendous job recruiting in some very long-term, in fact, employees at the University of Louisville who started their career managing residence halls. Frank Maienzo was one of those who actually started as a hall director under Denise, was promoted into an associate director position when she needed an associate director, and then as she was leaving and going into a different role on campus out of the dean's office or out of the student affairs office, Frank was promoted into the directorship. So Frank became a director in 1998. And in 98, he came on board. The offices then were over in what is known as the Miller Technology Building now, but it was the old Student Center. We broke ground on a new Student Center, the Student Activity Center, in 99. So for the first few months of his directorship, he was working out of the old area and watching a lot of things changing. Remember that I mentioned we built a suite building in 1990. He was instrumental in getting that building designed and funded and ready to be built, and actually hired an assistant director to help build that building, which was me, right at that time. So Frank was the one that made the decision that it would be okay to use graduate assistants who were working on their master's degrees in the residence halls, and that they should be students of the higher education master's program and or the counseling student personnel master's program. And that was a way of supporting the academic world of the campus. It was a way of helping to build skill and train future professionals of student affairs through a housing program. And so he started converting those full-time staff positions into graduate assistant positions in 98 with the start of the fall for 99, actually is when they started. And he made a decision to hire 2 assistant directors instead of just having 1 associate. 1 assistant director for residence life who would be able to manage not just the discipline and the conduct and the student crisis, but would really build a program of development that would build a program that taught these graduate assistants how to be good professionals, and that provided for students the mentoring and the growth and the leadership development that he had the vision could occur on this campus. And then he hired an assistant director of facilities to do nothing but to do the primary responsibility of managing the residence hall facilities. So the residence halls had been not well maintained over the years and were starting to show a lot of age and problems, and so that position was supposed to start renovating the halls, doing some cosmetic upgrades, and building this new suite building that was being designed to be built in 99 and opening in 99. So that was my position, and I came in and I was recruited in from the University of Texas to do that position, and Pam Curtis was the assistant director who had been one of the full-time hall directors who was recruited into the assistant director position. So that was a change, a shift in the way the housing program was being managed. No longer just responsible for providing a place to sleep or responsible for just being focused on the development, but a combination of both, so that the students could have their needs met as student development theory will project out is needed, but also would grow the program in a way that would start becoming a program of substance for young professionals. And that was started then. In 2001, Frank Maienzo stepped out of the director position, and I was hired in as an interim and then later hired through the search to be the director. So as I came into the directorship in 2001 and 2002, I was asked to convert us into an auxiliary unit, which meant the university expected us to be able to function as a standalone unit financially. We had to rely on our room rates and other ways of revenue that we could bring in to take care of the buildings. Again, these were aging buildings. We had debt on the buildings, and we were to convert to that. It took until about 2004 to make the full conversion. And as becoming an auxiliary unit, our role on campus changed a little, the way we do business changed a little, but we also were able to very closely, intentionally, keep developing that program of being a nationally known program for training young professionals in the field and for providing for our students a leadership and community-based program that taught them how to be future citizens. So the staffing over the years has changed. At different times, gone back and forth between full-time staff hall directors and part-time hall directors and grad hall directors. We currently are back to grad hall directors. We've changed it even a couple of times. And it just goes with what the field is doing and what we can do to make the best of the resources we have and yet produce the future career people of student affairs. And so that's been our program, both facility-wise and as a function on campus with staff and student programming and development. Now, do you think